peace. It was built in order to make sure that the nations would train for war no more. It was built by Andrew Carnegie, a very famous American philanthropist, very wealthy, and he sponsored this building. And this was going to introduce a whole new world era of peace and justice and righteousness. 1 year later, the world was in the First World War. And now, 100 years later, we are living in a generation where the world is full of war and conflict. So I think we're living in a very precious and important time. The International Court of Justice is situated in the Peace Palace. It's one of 4 institutions in the Peace Palace. There are 2 main international courts here in The Hague: the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice was established under the United Nations Charter in 1945. The Criminal Court is a much younger court. It was established in 2000. And the Criminal Court prosecutes individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The International Court of Justice hears disputes between nations, between states. And it also can issue advisory opinions, which is what is happening at the moment. The court has a lot of cases on the books. It's a very busy court at the moment. We not only have 2 genocide cases against Israel or involving Israel. There's another case that we don't hear much about. The Palestinians have sued the United States for moving their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They say that's a breach of international law. The United States says, well, good luck to you, we don't really care. So that case is not really going anywhere. But most importantly, we have this United Nations General Assembly request for an advisory opinion concerning the occupation of Palestinian territory. I want to thank the speakers this morning for laying the foundation for my talk and giving you the background about the history of the land and the Palestinian people. I want to just say that I think the Lord grieves for the Arab Palestinians. And when I say Arab Palestinians, the word Arab I think is a misnomer. Most Palestinians actually have their ethnic origins not in Saudi Arabia, but in most other parts of the world. They've come from Italy or Greece or the Balkans. The most Palestinians you'll speak to have a national heritage somewhere else, which is not to say many of them have not been living there for hundreds and hundreds of years. Let's not forget, for example, the Aramean Christians, who trace their origins right back to the time of Jesus. And we kind of pass them off as if they're Arab Palestinians. Well, they also belong in the land. So God is doing something very important, and I believe he has a purpose and destiny also for the non-Jewish people of the land, and we should be praying for them as well. So we've heard from Jack that the General Assembly passed a resolution at the end of December 2022. 87 states adopted a resolution. I think it's important to understand what is happening is all part of the United Nations system. Our nations, and perhaps this is the point I want to share with you today, it's our nations that are doing this. It's not the judges of the court. The judges have a very important role to play to administer the law, and we hope and pray they'll do that wisely. But it's our nations who brought us to this point, who've enabled this to happen. With this crazy paradigm of the 2-state solution, we've been trying to divide this land for 100 years, and now we want the court to help us to do it. But it's our choice. It's our nation's choices here. So I believe it's the nations that God will judge for what they are doing, which is, of course, not to say the court is playing an important role, and I think being here, we're interceding for these judges, we're lifting them up before the throne of God. Okay, let's just have a bit of a look at who these nations are. Well, first of all, the resolution itself. Jack mentioned it, but it's very important to read these words. Every spoken word, every written word has power, and I believe, I'm reminded always about the cursing and the blessing. God says, I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. And cursing and blessing are things we do with our mouths, with our words. We speak words. So here the General Assembly is speaking, I believe, a kind of a curse. It's a very negative And the court has asked two sets of questions. You can just take a moment to read it, but it's about the self-determination of the Palestinian people. It's about the alleged illegal occupation of the territory, and it's about Palestinian territory. So the court is actually being asked to assume here that Israel is violating Palestinian rights, that the occupation has become illegal, and that the territory is Palestinian. So in a way, these questions are very biased. They're inviting the court simply to give a rubber stamp to what the General Assembly has said. But I think it's important first to see who these nations are. Well, these are the nations that brought this resolution to the General Assembly. Every resolution is born in committees and councils. This one is sponsored by the states. You can read them. They're not friends of Israel. They brought this resolution for a reason. The last of the sponsors is Palestine. You might ask yourself, how did Palestine get on the list? It's not a state. Well, no, it's not a state, but it is a non-member UN observer state, which is this crazy thing that the UN invented in 2012 to give the Palestinians a status. They can now go to the international institutions and pretend that they are a state. And that's exactly what they're doing in this court. The co-sponsors, Djibouti, Kuwait, Pakistan, Somalia, Venezuela, and Yemen. So we have a bunch of states here already who have a political, ideological, and maybe even religious objective. Then you get a whole bunch of states who are then in, the resolution is brought to the General Assembly and it's voted upon. It's important to see how nations vote. A lot of nations abstain from voting when it comes to UN resolutions on Israel or other topics. That's a cop-out because they don't want to make a decision, yes or no. And we see it in this case. We had 87 states voting for this resolution. You can see them. I've highlighted the purple ones because they're the more or less Western states. So it's not only the Arabs and the Islamic states and others, it's also a number of European states which are behind this move. Spain is one of them, for example. Very, very anti-Israel at the moment. The ones in the middle are the ones that voted against. It's a very small number of 26, and then a large number of abstentions, and then states that are simply absent. If you're not in the room at the time, then you're absent. That can be a strategy as well. The point here is this is less than half the UN member states adopting this resolution. So what is happening is the UN is being hijacked, as it were, by a minority of states who are hostile to Western interests. But the Western states are allowing it to happen by abstaining and not voting against these resolutions. And I think, wouldn't it be amazing if we could mobilize some of these states that are sitting on the fence, that they could start to vote in favor of Israel, which is not to be against the Palestinians, but to be in favor of the rule of law and the rule of justice. Amen. Okay. Here again is the voting. This is what it looks like when you vote in the General Assembly. You can see every state a blue, a green or a red or a yellow or a black side. It's the same list as before. Okay, so what happens next is the court, the General Assembly delivers its resolution to the court through the Secretary General. The court then accepts the request for an opinion and invites the UN member states to bring submissions to the court. So every one of our countries had the opportunity to speak into the court. Some nations took that opportunity, some didn't. Only 53 have done so. That's a quarter of the number of UN member states. And 3 international organizations, the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the African Union. These are groups that represent well over half the number of UN member states. Israel is not participating in these proceedings. It submitted a very short statement in July last year, but for the rest, Israel is saying we are not a part of this, which is kind of bizarre when the whole thing is about Israel, everybody's talking about Israel, everybody's criticizing Israel, and Israel is just not present. I understand the reasons for doing that. One of them simply being lack of resources. You know, these genocide cases brought by South Africa take a lot of resources to deal with. And the legal team in Israel is not huge, so they can't deal with all of these cases. Okay, no other organisations were allowed to participate, and not even third parties or individuals. You cannot submit what's called an amicus curiae brief to this court unless you're invited to do so, and they did not invite. Okay, this is the state of Palestine. We get now to all these states. They make written submissions. There were 2 rounds of those last year. In February this year, they all came to the courts here, just up the road, a few hundred metres away, in the Peace Palace, 53 nation states and the international organisations, and 7 full days of hearings before the judges. And we were fortunate to be representing or helping the state of Republic of Fiji, very small island state near Nauru, down in the Pacific. And Fiji said, we want to stand in this court on behalf of Israel. We want to raise a voice into the court to support Israel. And of course, every state has a vote in the UN, has a right, so Fiji's voice counts. But this whole week started off with half a day of the state of Palestine. Half a day. Every other state got half an hour, but the Palestinians get half a day to present their case. And it was 3 hours full of vitriolic, I would say abusive cursing of Israel. Israel is a violator of international law. Israel is a gross infringer of human rights, crimes against humanity, whatever you can think of, it was all thrown at the court. This is the chief counsel for Palestine. Some of you might recognize him. His name is Philippe Sands. He's a very famous professor of law in London. He's also Jewish, and he is the chief counsel for Palestine. He's very famous. He wrote an amazing book, East-West Street. You should read it if you haven't. Put everything I said aside for a moment. His book is actually brilliant. It's about Poland and Lviv in the 1940s, international law. Great book, but unfortunately I think he's on the wrong side in this case. He's a brilliant lawyer. He brought the case with passion. Palestinians are basically claiming 3 things. The Palestinian right to self-determination on Palestinian territory, meaning all of Mandate Palestine. That's their claim. It has been since 1920, and today they're bringing it to the highest court of the world. Secondly, the occupation of Palestinian territory has become illegal since 1967. Israel's control, administration of the so-called West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, they say it's become illegal because of settlements, because of annexation. And thirdly, they go on and on about discrimination against the non-Jewish population. They call it apartheid. These are the allegations. What do they demand? They demand a total, immediate, and unconditional end to the occupation. So, in other words, every Jew must leave Judea and Samaria and the old city of Jerusalem. It's not a small claim. They claim the right of the Palestinian people to have a state. They say, we have a right to self-determination. It overrides everything else, Oslo Accords, whatever else. This right of self-determination is so fundamental that the court should recognize it. And third states should be pressuring Israel to comply through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. The Arab League and the African Union were full on in the courts. This is Ralph Wild. He's another British barrister. The British somehow love to do this kind of stuff. It's not the British, it's the Americans, I'm sad to say. A lot of Harvard professors were here, Yale, Stanford, you name it. It's the big academic names who they bring in. Ralph Wild is one of them. They have 22 member states, 22 Arab League member states and 55 African Union member states. And of course their position is the same as it was in 1967, the 3 no's of Khartoum. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Okay, so they're saying we will not enter an agreement with Israel on all of this. We demand a decision by the court recognizing our rights. Ralph Wild went on. His was the most, I would call, anti-Semitic speech I heard that whole week. And he called the even existence of the Jewish state illegitimate and racist and discriminatory. The whole idea that the Jewish people should have a nation of their own the court is being told, is a fundamental breach of human rights. All of Palestine belongs to the Palestinians from the river to the sea. We get the Organization Islamic Cooperation, 57 member states. The core of their claim was Al-Quds, Jerusalem. That's their driving thrust of their claims, is the right to Jerusalem. It's not just East Jerusalem. It's the city of Jerusalem. You remember in the resolution that the court is being asked to determine on, it's about the holy city of Jerusalem, not just East Jerusalem. Okay, I'm going to have to move a little more quickly. So the Palestinian Arab Islamic African position, if we might call it that, the Palestinian right to self-determination is absolute. All of Mandate Palestine belongs to the Palestinians. The occupation is illegal. So are the discriminatory practices and policies of Israel. And the Oslo Accords, we can simply forget about them. So all those attempts by Israel in the 1990s to reach an agreement, the Palestinians say it's no longer relevant, Israel's not complying anyway. These fundamental rights override all of that. Now, Israel's position, I think it's important to understand, I think is part of the reason for all of this, is the position Israel has taken since 1967. And it's a complicated one, but basically at the foundation of it, Israel has not, until today, claimed sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. Right? The reason that there is a so-called occupation or administration is because Israel is not asserting sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. It is over Jerusalem. Immediately after the Six-Day War, Israel incorporated the whole city into the state of Israel. They consider it as part of their sovereign territory. But Judea and Samaria, they haven't done that. They say they have rights, claims, but not sovereignty. Sovereignty is somehow in abeyance, is a term that's used. It means it's kind of up here somewhere. And until there's an agreement, there is no sovereignty in the West Bank. So they've created a kind of vacuum of sovereignty. And I think this is a problem because the Palestinians have stepped into that vacuum and they're filling it with Palestinian claims and rights. Okay.